My father's last words weren't, "I love you." They were a whisper of a bank account number. I spent 5 years learning what it bought, not a fortune, but the perfect revenge. The betrayal did not arrive with a dramatic confrontation or a discovered secret. It came in the quiet, sterile hum of a hospital room, wrapped in the scent of antiseptic and dying flowers. This is the story of Elara Vance. For her, the ultimate price of betrayal was not paid in blood, but in the slow, cruel theft of a future. Her father, Thomas Vance, was not a wealthy man, but he was a rich one. His wealth was in his calloused hands, his encyclopedic knowledge of vintage cars, and the laughter that echoed through their modest garage-turned workshop in the sun-baked suburbs of Phoenix. Elara's world was one of carburetors and camshafts, of grease under her fingernails, and the symphony of a perfectly tuned engine. Her mother was a faded photograph. It had always been just her and Dad. And then there was Leo. Leo with the smile that didn't quite reach his watchful eyes, who appeared one day with a 1967 Mustang in need of a miracle. Leo, who charmed Thomas with shared stories of engines and enterprise, who lingered after the work was done, sharing a beer, then a meal, then plans. He became, in a frighteningly short time, the uncle Elara never had, the partner her father always wanted. Thomas, with his open heart and trusting soul, saw a kindred spirit. Elara, 17 and intuitively cautious, saw a man who calculated his smiles. The betrayal was financial, a slow siphoning executed with the precision of a master mechanic, but using legal documents instead of wrenches. A new business venture, Vance and Mercer Classic Automotives. Thomas, overwhelmed by Leo's expertise, signed papers he didn't fully understand, using the garage, their home, as collateral. Leo's assurances were as smooth as engine oil. The collapse was swift. One evening, over meatloaf, Leo was animated, talking about a big deal, a shipment of rare parts. The next morning, he was gone. So was the bank account. So was the Mustang. And a man in a suit arrived with papers stating the property was now owned by a holding company. The medical bills from Thomas's recently diagnosed heart condition had been piling up. Leo had generously offered to handle the finances. He had handled them straight into his own offshore accounts. The shock was a physical blow. Thomas Vance, a mountain of a man to Elara, crumpled. The stress, the shame, the sheer violation triggered a massive coronary. He died in the intensive care unit a week later, his hand squeezed by a daughter who could only whisper, I'm sorry, I should have seen it." Grief was a desert, vast and empty. But in its core, a seed of something else took root, a cold, hard crystal of purpose. The police called it a sophisticated fraud, a civil matter. The trail, they said, was cold. Leo Mercer had vanished into the ether. Elara, at 18, was utterly alone. The house was gone. She took a small insurance payout, buried her father, and bought a one-way ticket to nowhere in particular. She drifted, a ghost in her own life. The Greyhound bus deposited her in Amarillo, Texas, under a sky so vast it felt like a rebuke. She found a room for a week's rent in a peeling clapboard house that smelled of fried onions and defeat. The job at the truck stop, Big Rig Bonanza, was a study in human transience. She served pie and coffee to faces blurred by fatigue and distance, her own face a blank plate. She spoke only when necessary, her voice a monotone. At night, in her narrow bed, she didn't dream of her father. She dreamt of paperwork, of columns of numbers that bled into each other, of Leo's smiling face on a postage stamp floating away. The library became her chapel. She spent her off hours in the hushed nonfiction aisles, starting with books like Understanding Financial Fraud and The Psychology of the Con Artist. The language was initially impenetrable: derivatives, shell companies, Ponzi schemes. She treated it like a foreign engine manual, diagramming sentences, looking up every third word. She filled legal pads with notes, drawing lines between concepts, building a schematic of deception. She understood now that Leo hadn't been a genius. He'd been a predator who understood trust was the weakest security system in the world. But knowledge alone was a map without a vehicle. She needed skills. An ad in the local penny saver led her to Malachi's Salvage and Security, a sprawling graveyard of cars on the dusty fringes of El Paso. Malachi was a man in his 60s, built like a fire plug, with a network of scars across his knuckles and eyes the color of tarnished silver. He looked at her, this too thin girl with shadows under her eyes, and saw not a victim, but a specific kind of hunger. "You want to work here, you got to earn it," he grunted. "Start by sorting bolts, metric from standard. By size and thread. Don't mix 'em." It was mind-numbing, hand-blackening work. For a week, she sorted bolts in the blistering heat, the metallic ting of her sorting the only sound. Malachi watched from the shade of his corrugated iron shack. Finally, he ambled over. "You got patience," he conceded. "Most people go mad after a day. Why you here?" "I need to learn," she said, not looking up. "Learn what?" "How things work, how to take them apart. How to make them open." Malachi's gaze sharpened. He saw the ledger tucked under her lunch pail, covered in financial notes. "You ain't talking about cars." "Everything is a system," she said, echoing something she'd read. "Cars, locks, security people, they all have a design, a weakness." A slow, grim smile spread across Malachi's face. "All right, kid, graduate from Bolts." Her education accelerated. Malachi, she learned, was a man who'd seen systems fail catastrophically, in wars, in prisons, in marriages. His philosophy was one of pragmatic dismantling. He started her on locks, not just picking, but understanding them. He gave her a transparent practice lock. "Watch," he said, turning the key. She saw the pins lift, the shear line align, the cylinder turn. "See that moment of alignment? That's the sigh. Every lock has one. Your job is to listen for it." He taught her the feel of a tension wrench, the delicate probe of a pick. She practiced for hours, until her fingers were numb and her mind was a map of pin tumblers and wafer locks. He moved her to cars. Not just hot wiring, but understanding alarm systems, immobilizers, GPS trackers. They'd practice on the junked shells. "Modern security is a web," he said. "You don't fight the web. You find the spider, or you become a ghost in the wires." He showed her how to build a rudimentary RF jammer from scavenged parts, how to identify and disable tracking devices. He taught her about cameras, their blind spots, their loops, their power sources. "Now, the hardest system," he said one evening as they sat sharing a can of beans. "The human one, you want to be a ghost. You gotta understand what people see and what they don't." He made her people watch at a nearby mall. "Describe that woman," he'd say. "Not her clothes, her gait, the weight in her bag, the focus in her eyes. Is she expecting trouble? Is she hiding?" He taught her about tells, the glance at an exit, the touch of a wallet, the forced calm of a liar. He drilled her on identity. "A name is just a label, but a background, that's a texture. You need details. What was your childhood pet's name? Your first grade teacher? The smell of your grandmother's house? You gotta feel those things, or the lie won't hold weight." They crafted personas together. Ellie, the mousy data entry clerk. Al, the itinerant welder. Each came with a history, a mannerism, a way of speaking. One night, he handed her a small, heavy object wrapped in oilcloth. It was a gun, a compact 9. "I ain't teaching you to use this," he said, his voice gravelly serious. "I'm teaching you that it exists. That men like the one you're hunting will have them. Knowing a tool's weight, its purpose, its danger, that's part of seeing the system." After 2 years, Malachi declared her education complete. The night before she left, he gave her a final gift. A custom lockpick set, the handles made from the polished piston of a Ford flathead Vate. "Remember," he said, "vengeance is a cold engine. It'll get you moving, but it won't keep you warm. Don't let it be the only thing under your hood." She left El Paso with a new set of tools, a hardened soul, and a destination now forming in her mind. The high-value world where a wolf like Leo would hide among the wealthy sheep. For the next 3 years, Elara moved through America's underbelly, testing her skills and refining her target. She worked in a garage instant, Louis where the owner ran chop shop operations on the side. She learned about VIN etching and rebranding, the dark mirror of classic car restoration. In Chicago, she spent 6 months as a night auditor at a boutique hotel, observing the rituals of the wealthy, their demands, their carelessness, their unshakable belief in their own permanence. All the while, she curated her ultimate persona, Elle. This wasn't just an alias, it was a work of art, a forgery of a human being. She began with the foundation, voice and cadence. She downloaded podcasts and interviews with art historians, heiresses, and gallery owners from the Northeast. She practiced their vowels, their slight boredom, the way they used silence as punctuation. In her rented rooms, she would hold imaginary conversations about Boucher and brushstroke techniques until the accent was muscle memory. The physical transformation was next. She studied posture, the straight spine of private schooling, the slight, dismissive tilt of the head. She practiced walking in second-hand designer heels on uneven pavement until she could move over gravel as smoothly as over marble. She learned about fabrics, how linen wrinkled, how silk draped, how cashmere felt. She invested in a few timeless pieces from consignment shops in wealthy zip codes: a cream-colored Smythe blazer, a pair of perfectly fitted wool trousers, a simple silk shell. They were her armor. The legend of Elara Vance, independent authenticator, was built online, in the shadowy forums and private networks of the art world. Using a hacked credential to access a closed database, she inserted vague references to her work for European private collections and discrete attribution services. She created a minimalist, encrypted website that revealed nothing but suggested everything. She cultivated an aura of elusive expertise, the kind that couldn't be verified through normal channels, which only made it more desirable to those who believed they operated above such channels. The Bait, the Lost Chase painting, was her most audacious creation. Her research told her that Julian Thorne's collection, while impressive, lacked a certain gravitas. He had flashy post-war works and perfect fakes, but no quiet, undeniable masterpiece with a story. He craved legitimacy. She found her forger, Pavel, through a labyrinth of encrypted chats on the dark web. His digital forgeries were legendary. He didn't just copy, he reverse-engineered an artist's soul onto a blank digital canvas. For a staggering sum that emptied her savings, he created Coastal Light, Southampton, a small, sun-dappled chase landscape that never existed. He provided not just the image, but its digital DNA. Spectral analysis reports, UV fluorescence maps, simulated age cracks. "The art is in the doubt," Pavel wrote. "We give him reason to believe, and his own greed will do the rest." For 8 months, she seeded the rumor. A modified entry in a scanned auction catalog uploaded to a niche archive. A footnote added to a digitized art journal article. A veiled mention by a fictional Swiss collector in a private, invitation-only forum. She let the ghost of the painting drift through the world Julian Thorne inhabited, a tantalizing wisp. The final touch was the provocation. Using the compromised account of a dealer she knew Thorne occasionally used, a man with middling taste and large debts, she sent a carefully worded, slightly confused email to Thorne's estate manager, mentioning the Chase Whisper and recommending the preternaturally discreet Elara Vance. The invitation to Sandpiper's Reach was the click of a trap she had spent 5 years building. As she read it, she felt no thrill, only the cold satisfaction of a perfect tool fitting into its intended slot. The hired car was a black sedan, anonymous and clean. As it approached the Hamptons estate, Elara methodically shut down parts of herself. She visualized a series of locks, clicking into place. The grief, the fury, the girl from the garage, all were secured in a deep interior vault. What remained was a cool, observant intelligence whose Sandpiper's Reach was a study in defensive opulence. The modernist lines were meant to suggest openness, but the sight lines were controlled, the windows were surely ballistic glass, and the gate's mechanism hummed with quiet, expensive power. When Julian appeared in the doorway, time seemed to warp. He was both exactly the same and utterly different. The silver in his hair suited him, the softness in his jaw spoke of indulgence. But the eyes, those watchful, assessing eyes, were frozen in time. They swept over her, registering the clothes, the posture, the satchel. They saw a useful object, not a person. Good. His voice was deeper, polished by years of assumed authority. "Miss Vance, a pleasure. Mr. Thorne, thank you for seeing me on such short notice." Her handshake was brief, her touch cool. She let her gaze sweep past him into the house, showing professional interest, not personal awe. The tour was an autopsy of his soul. The Francis Bacon was all screaming popes and distorted flesh, a display of edgy taste. The Monet water lilies were serene, but her trained eye, sharpened by Pavel's lessons, caught the too-perfect consistency of the brushstrokes in the digital reproduction she'd studied. It was a superb fake, which told her more about his need for status than a real one would have. He was a man who bought labels, not art. Then, the garage. The wall of glass revealed a cathedral to mechanical obsession. The cars were flawless, static like insects in amber. And there, centered, was the Mustang. Her breath hitched, a microscopic tremor she instantly converted into a slight, appreciative sigh. The car was a resurrection. Her father's labor of love completed by thieves. The scent of it, even through the glass, was a memory made physical. "A magnificent collection," she remarked, her voice steady. "The Mustang is particularly stunning. A Shelby GT500, if I'm not mistaken." His pleasure was palpable. "You know your cars." "Beauty often has a brutal price," she said. It was a test, not a flicker. The past was truly dead to him. In the study, the chase was displayed on an easel. She approached it with the reverence of a scholar. For over an hour, she was purely Elle, the expert. She used a loupe, a high-powered flashlight, talking softly about Chase's palette during his Long Island period, his use of impasto in the dune grasses. She praised the painting's feeling, its luminosity. She made him fall in love with it. Then she introduced the flaw. With her portable spectrometer, she took a reading. She frowned, a tiny, professional crease between her brows. "That's odd." She took another. "There's a consistency in the titanium white underpainting here. The particle distribution is remarkably uniform for a hand-ground pigment of the period. It suggests a later addition, or a remarkably sophisticated anomaly." She let concern seep into her tone. "I'll need to do a stratified particle analysis. Compare it to the core samples in the Chase archives at the Met. It could take a few days." She saw the calculation in his eyes, a delay versus the risk of a flawed acquisition, his vanity won. He couldn't bear the idea of imperfection or of being seen to have made a mistake. The guest cottage was offered. "Efficiency," he said. The cottage was a cell of taste. That night, the storm wasn't just cover, it was a partner. The howling wind masked any sound, the lashing rain blinded the external cameras. Her entry into the main house was a ballet of pre-planned moves. The security system had a heartbeat, a regular digital pulse she'd mapped during the day by posing questions to the smart house system about air quality and lighting, listening to its responses. Her homemade device, a Raspberry Pi tucked in her satchel, mimicked that pulse, whispering all is well to the central hub. Inside, the house was a tomb. Her feet made no sound on the polished concrete. The study door yielded to her picks with a sigh Malachi would have approved. The search was systematic. She didn't look for a safe. She looked for the hiding place of a man who thought himself clever. The false panel in the drawer was classic, too classic for a high-tech fraud, which is why it worked. The ledger was a relic, and that made it real. Sitting on the floor of the study, the storm raging outside, she photographed every page. The dry entries were narratives of ruin. Phoenix, T. Vance. Then, disposals. The folder on the USB was a descent into a deeper darkness. It contained emails to a Dr. Armitage discussing Thomas Vance's unfortunate resilience and the need for additional stress factors to ensure liquidation of the liability. Medical sabotage. Murder. The cold in her heart turned to absolute zero. She took the USB. He needed to know he'd been violated. The next 2 days were a high-wire act of excruciating normalcy. She was Elle, diligent and slightly preoccupied. She spent hours with the painting, running tests that involved mostly staring at her own spectrometer's display, generating fake data streams on a connected laptop. She cultivated Lillian. They met in the sunroom, a glass box filled with orchids that looked as artificial as the rest of the house. Lillian was a watercolor left in the rain, her colors blurred and bleeding. She spoke in fragments. "He liked my paintings once," she said, stirring her tea endlessly. "Then he said they were derivative. He bought me this." She gestured at the room, the house, her own exquisite clothing. "It's all derivative now. I am. I don't remember what I wanted to paint." Elle listened, offering no pity, which Lillian seemed to find refreshing. "Do you have anywhere to go?" Elle asked once, her voice low. Lillian's eyes, a faded blue, widened with fear. "There's no away from him. He finds things. He owns them." What if he was preoccupied? Permanently? Lillian stared, then gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. A silent pact was forged. On the third day, Elle requested a meeting. The atmosphere in the study was different. Leo was anticipatory, ready to claim his prize. Lillian sat in a corner, a silent, beautiful fixture. Elle began with the lie, delivered with flawless regret. "It's a forgery." She cited her fabricated data, the anachronistic pigments. She watched his face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and finally, a rage that was all about wounded pride. "I will have that seller's head for this," he snarled, the polished Julian Thorne veneer cracking to reveal the vicious Leo Mercer beneath. Elle's smile was a thin, cold blade. "Be careful of revenge, Julian. It has a way of circling back. Like a faulty engine timing." The phrase did it. His head snapped up. His eyes locked onto hers, searching, probing the familiar contours of her face now stripped of its youth and softness. "Do I know you, Miss Vance?" She let the silence hang, let him squirm in the unknown. Then she shattered his world with a name. "Leo." What followed was a symphony of his unraveling: the dead intercom, the missing gun. His offers of money, growing increasingly desperate, were the final proof of his incomprehension. He still believed everything was a transaction. "I don't want your things, Leo. I want your fear." The destruction of the Mustang was the first, visceral movement of that symphony. His scream was the sound of a soul being gutted. As she triggered the secondary charges, a small EMP device in the server closet that fried his digital life, a call to a pre-programmed number that patched her directly to an FBI financial crimes unit, reciting the ledger's location and the evidence of murder. She narrated his downfall. She was the voice of his fate. Herding him into the garage, the sirens a growing chorus in the distance, was the final movement. He stood amidst the acrid smoke, the ruined heart of the Mustang before him, the other cars silent witnesses. She left him there, not with a weapon, but with a narrative, the ruined king amid his fallen idols. She met Lillian's eyes at the side gate, handed her a car key and a slip of paper with a phone number. "Drive, don't stop. Call that number when you're clear. They'll tell you what to do next." Lillian clutched the key like a lifeline and vanished into the night. On the dunes, Elle stripped off her costume. The linen, the pearls, the watch, all were shells. Underneath, she wore dark, functional clothing. She retrieved the motorcycle helmet and walked to where the bike was hidden. She did not look back. The miles unspooled beneath her, a black ribbon leading away from the fire. She rode for days, stopping only for fuel, her body operating on autopilot. The cold focus that had sustained her was gone, leaving a cavernous silence. She felt like a weapon that had been fired, now smoking and useless. She holed up in a motel in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a damp, pine-scented place. For a week, she didn't leave the room. She watched the news on a tiny, buzzing television. The capture of Julian Thorne was a minor story, a financial crime blip. There was no mention of Thomas Vance. The ledger, it seemed, had been balanced in the eyes of the law, but not in her soul. The numbness was absolute. She moved again, drifting west. She found the town in Washington state almost by accident, a place where the evergreen forests met the gray sea. The rain was constant, a soft, forgiving shroud. She rented the cabin under the name Arden, a neutral name that felt as empty as she did. The job at Hanson's garage was a return to the simplest mechanics: oil changes, brake jobs, tire rotations. The work was physical, repetitive, and demanded nothing of the mind she had so fiercely honed. Her coworkers were quiet men who asked no questions. She was just the new mechanic, capable and silent. The dreams started here, not of Leo or the revenge, but of her father's hands. She'd wake with the phantom scent of gasoline and Old Spice, the sound of his laugh ringing in her ears, so vivid it was a physical pain. The memories were no longer nightmares. They were visitations, reminders of what had been sacrificed on the altar of her vengeance. Walter, the old engineer with the Ford pickup, became an accidental anchor. He saw through her silence not to her pain, but to her skill. "You got a restorer's touch," he'd say, watching her calibrate a carburetor with infinitesimal adjustments. He invited her to his barn, a cluttered, holy space filled with the skeletons of antique farm equipment. The work here was different. It wasn't about fixing to run, it was about healing to last. It was reverence. One rainy afternoon, as they painstakingly cleaned 100-year-old gear teeth, Walter spoke without looking up. "You're carrying a load meant for a truck, kid, not a person. You can set it down. The past ain't a cage unless you keep rebuilding the bars every day." She had no answer, but his words, like the constant rain, began to wear at the stone inside her. The envelope, when it arrived, was a shock. The system of mail drops was a vestige of her old life, a thread she hadn't quite cut. The note inside was like a whisper from a ghost. The ledger is not yet balanced. Check account VM. A friend, it took her a day to muster the courage. In the back of the town's library, on a shuddering public terminal, she navigated the hidden pathways. The VM account. The money, frozen for years, had been unfrozen and redirected. The transaction log showed it had been accessed and resecured by L. Thorne, executor for victim restitution. Lillian. Elara sat in the dim light, the hum of the computer the only sound. She didn't see a number. She saw an apology from a stranger. She saw a line, however faint, drawn under a column. She saw the ghost of her father's garage, not as a crime scene, but as a place where work and love had once coexisted. The tears came then, hot and silent, streaming down her face in the dusty library silence. They were not tears of happiness, but of release. The dam of frozen feeling she'd built over 5 years finally cracked. She cried for her father, for the girl she'd been, for the years lost, for the life she'd taken as surely as she'd taken Leo's. She cried until she was hollowed out and clean. She didn't touch the money for months. It sat in the account, a neutral fact. Walter's barn became her sanctuary. She started a project of her own, with his blessing. A 1929 Ford Model A pickup found rotting in a field. It was a basket case, missing more parts than it had. It was perfect. The work was slow, methodical. She wasn't rebuilding it to showroom condition. She was bringing it back to life, honoring its scars where she could, repairing where she must. She sourced parts from other salvaged vehicles, machined others herself on Walter's old lathe. She painted it not a glossy black, but the deep, earthy green of pine forests. As she worked, she thought, not with the plodding intensity of before, but with a quiet clarity. Malachi's words echoed, "Vengeance is a cold engine." Walter's followed, "The past is a tool." She had used her past as a weapon. Could she now use it as a foundation? The idea for Vance Restoration and Mechanics emerged gradually. It would be a place for cars with stories, for owners who loved them, not just invested in them. It would be honest work. The money from the VM account would be the seed. It felt right, not a reward, but a restitution, a fragment of her father's legacy returning to do good work. She scouted locations, finally settling on Colorado for the clear light and the space. The garage she found was a former feed store with good bones and room to grow. The sign, with its bird in flight, was designed by a local artist. It cost too much, but it felt essential. Opening day was quiet. A few locals wandered in out of curiosity. A man brought in a 1970 Chevelle with a misfire. As she diagnosed it, a familiar calm settled over her. This was a problem she could solve. This was a system she could heal. Weeks turned into months. The business found its rhythm. She hired a kid, Jake, who hung around the shop, all eager hands and troubled eyes. She saw herself in him, the anger, the directionless skill. She taught him, as her father had taught her, with patience and firmness. She gave him the bolt-sorting test Malachi had given her. He lasted 2 days before complaining. She just nodded and said, "Start again. This time, listen to what the bolts are telling you." One evening, after closing, she stood in the workshop. The green Model A was finished, sitting proudly by the bay door. The scent of the shop, oil, metal, clean solvent, was no longer the smell of loss, but of creation. She picked up her father's old wrench, its handle worn smooth by 2 generations of hands. On a bench, a new project waited. A dilapidated 1963 Corvette Stingray, its fiberglass body cracked, its engine seized. It was a mess. It was perfect. She walked to the small office at the back of the shop. On the wall hung 2 things. A framed, faded photo of her father laughing next to the Mustang's engine block, and the polished piston-head lockpick set from Malachi. They were not trophies of war, but reminders of her teachers, of her path. She sat at the desk and opened a fresh ledger. Not a ledger of debts and vengeance, but of projects and parts orders. On the first line, she wrote, "Stingray client, M. Alvarez. Assessment, full mechanical and body restoration. Estimated time, 8 months." Outside, the last of the sunset painted the Rockies in shades of rose and gold. The road that had once stretched before her, empty and terrifying, now simply led to tomorrow's work. The caged bird had not just sung its song of ruin. It had used the broken bars to build a new nest. The ultimate price of betrayal had been paid in full by both betrayer and avenger. And in the quiet aftermath, Elara Vance, with grease under her fingernails and the ghost of a tune in her heart, began, slowly and surely, to buy back her own soul, one honest repair at a time. The engine of her life, once cold and tuned only for revenge, now turned over with a new, steady, and purposeful rhythm.